50 battles. Some traditions count even more. Every single one of them ends the same way. A Muslim victory, or at the very least, an army saved from destruction. No routes. No collapses. In roughly 7 years of continuous warfare against 2 empires and a peninsula full of rebellions, the man leading those armies never once lost. And then one ordinary day, in a bed, with no sword in his hand, he died of a fever. And according to the traditions that record his final words, he did not experience that as relief. He experienced it as the one defeat his record could never erase. This is the story of Khalid bin Walid, the sword of Allah, undefeated on every field he ever commanded. And the question we are going to sit with today is simple. Why did a man who feared nothing in combat treat an ordinary death as the worst thing that had ever happened to him? To understand the ending, you have to understand where he started. Khalid was born around 592 CE in Mecca, into the Banu Makhzum, one of the most powerful clans within the Quraysh tribe. His father, al-Mughira, was among the wealthiest and most influential men in the city. And the Banu Makhzum were known for one thing above all else: excellence in warfare. Horsemanship, weapons training, battlefield leadership. This was not a family that produced merchants or poets. It produced commanders, generation after generation. Khalid grew up inside that machine from childhood. Long before he ever heard the word Islam, he was already known across Mecca as a gifted and instinctive military mind, the kind of young man older warriors watched carefully because they suspected he would surpass them. Mecca itself, in this period, was not a quiet trading town. It sat at the crossroads of caravan routes running between Yemen and the Levant, which meant its most powerful families needed men who could protect wealth as easily as they could grow it. Being raised inside the Banu Makhzum meant being raised to think in terms of formations, terrain, and timing, the same instincts that would later define every battlefield he commanded on either side of the conflict to come. Which makes what happened next even harder to explain by talent alone. When the Prophet Muhammad began preaching in Mecca, the Banu Makhzum, under men like Abu Jahl, became some of his fiercest opponents. Khalid grew up inside that opposition. He was present at the Battle of Badr in 624, fighting on the Quraysh side, watching relatives of his own die in the defeat that followed. He was there again at the Battle of Uhud in 625. And Uhud is where historians still point to something remarkable. At Uhud, the Muslim army held a strong position early in the battle, largely because a small unit of archers had been posted on a hill overlooking the field with strict orders to hold that position no matter what happened below. As the battle turned in the Muslims' favor, many of those archers believed victory was already secured and left their post to join the looting of the retreating Quraysh camp. Khalid, commanding the Quraysh cavalry on the opposing side, was watching that hill. He saw the gap open before anyone else on either side seemed to register what was happening. And he moved immediately, swinging his horsemen around the now undefended flank and turning what should have been a Muslim victory into a devastating reversal that nearly reached the Prophet himself. That single decision, made in seconds, by a man who did not yet believe a word of the message he was fighting against, is still studied today as one of the sharpest tactical reads in early Islamic military history. He was, at that point, still very much the enemy. And he was already this good. He fought again at the Battle of the Trench, still opposing the Muslims, leading cavalry that tried to prevent Muslim forces from breaking out during the siege of Medina. 3 major engagements. 3 times standing directly against the Prophet's forces. And 3 times walking away having proven, beyond any argument, that he understood the mechanics of war better than almost anyone else alive in Arabia at the time. So what changed? By the time of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, cracks were already forming in Khalid's certainty. Tradition holds that his own brother, Walid, had already converted, and wrote to him directly, saying that the Prophet had asked after him by name and had remarked that a man of Khalid's ability had no business remaining ignorant of the message, that his strength belonged with the Muslims rather than against them. Sometime after that letter, in the 8th year after the migration to Medina, Khalid rode north and declared his faith. He was around 40 years old at the time. Not a young convert swept up in enthusiasm. A grown, proven commander, walking away from everything his tribe and his family had spent his entire life building him to become. And almost immediately, the Prophet did something he did for no one else in the entire community. He gave Khalid a title. Sef Allah. The sword of Allah, sometimes rendered more precisely as the unsheathed sword of God, a phrase meaning a blade already drawn, already in motion, never resting in its scabbard. Not a nickname that accumulated slowly over years of legend building. A title spoken directly, early, by Muhammad himself, at the Battle of Mu'tah in 629. Here is exactly what earned it. At Mu'tah, roughly 3,000 Muslim soldiers faced a Byzantine force that outnumbered them by a staggering margin, by some traditional accounts more than 30 to 1. The battle began badly. The three commanders leading the Muslim army were killed one after another in the fighting, each taking up the banner after the last one fell. With the army teetering on the edge of total collapse, the banner was finally handed to Khalid. And instead of a rout, instead of the annihilation that seemed inevitable given the numbers on the field, Khalid organized one of the most disciplined fighting retreats recorded in ancient warfare. Overnight, he reshuffled his formations to make the army look larger and better organized than it actually was. He rotated units in and out of visible positions to confuse Byzantine scouts about his true numbers. And over the following hours, he pulled the entire force back to safety without the Byzantines fully grasping what had happened until it was already too late to press their advantage. Some accounts say he broke 8 swords in his own hand during that single day of fighting, the blade simply failing under the strain of continuous combat. It was after Mu'tah that the title Sef Allah was spoken for the first time. Not for a conquest. For a retreat that saved an army from annihilation. The Sword of Allah earned his name not by winning everything on that particular day, but by refusing to let a hopeless position collapse into a massacre. That alone should tell you something about what kind of commander he was. But Mu'tah was only the beginning. After the Prophet's death in 632, much of Arabia fractured into open rebellion. Tribes that had submitted during Muhammad's life now refused to recognize the new caliph, Abu Bakr, and a man named Musaylima rose up claiming prophethood of his own, gathering a large following in the region of Yarmouk. These conflicts, known collectively as the Ridda Wars, are some of the least discussed chapters of Khalid's career, and arguably some of the most consequential. This was not a war against an outside empire. This was holding together a young nation on the edge of dissolving in its very first year without its founder. Khalid was given field command in Najd and then in the Yarmouk itself, facing tribal armies and Musaylima's forces directly. The fighting at Yarmouk was brutal, some of the bloodiest of Khalid's career, and the stakes were nothing less than existential. Had the Ridda Wars gone the other way, there may have been no Islamic state left standing to expand outward at all. These victories are far less romanticized than his later campaigns against empires, but they were arguably the ones that mattered most, because without them, none of what followed happens. The fighting at Yarmouk deserves its own moment here, because of how close it came to going the other way. Musaylima's forces fought with a determination that surprised even seasoned Muslim commanders, and at one point during the battle, the Muslim army was pushed back hard enough that morale nearly broke entirely. Khalid reorganized his men mid-battle, tribe by tribe, giving each group its own banner and its own section of the line, restoring order in the middle of chaos. The fighting eventually concentrated around a walled garden where Musaylima's remaining forces had taken shelter, a location remembered afterward as the Garden of Death because of how many men fell there before the battle finally turned. Musaylima himself was killed before the day ended, and with him, the single greatest internal threat to the survival of the new Muslim state. Historians who study this period often argue that Yarmouk, not any battle against Persia or Rome, was the true test of whether the community founded by the Prophet would survive its first year without him. Then came the campaigns that turned a regional faith into an empire spanning continents. Khalid was given command in Iraq against the Sasanian Persian Empire in 633, and he moved with a speed that unsettled his own allies as much as the enemy he was fighting. When ordered to shift theaters entirely and reinforce the Muslim armies fighting the Byzantines in Syria, Khalid led his army on a march through terrain that most commanders of the era would have simply refused to attempt, a crossing that pushed his forces to the edge of survival before they had even reached a battlefield. He arrived in Syria not depleted by the journey, but ready, and immediately became the decisive factor in campaign after campaign that followed. The sieges of Homs and Aleppo. The Battle of Hazar. Each engagement chipping further away at Byzantine control over the region. And then, in 636, everything built toward a single day. The Battle of Yarmouk. The Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Heraclius, assembled one of the largest forces it had fielded in years, determined to crush the Muslim armies in Syria once and for all and reverse everything that had been lost. Khalid commanded the Muslim side. What followed is remembered today as one of the most decisive battles in world history. Byzantine control of the Levant, a region the empire had held for centuries, effectively ended within days. Historians still study Yarmouk as a masterclass in reading terrain, exploiting weather and visibility, and maneuvering an enemy into a position where its sheer numerical advantage meant almost nothing. After Yarmouk, the door into Syria was not simply open. It was permanently, irreversibly changed. There is one detail from Yarmouk worth sitting with, because it shows exactly how Khalid thought under pressure. On the day of the main engagement, a fierce sandstorm blew directly into the faces of the Byzantine lines, cutting visibility and disorienting soldiers who were already exhausted from days of skirmishing. Khalid had positioned his forces with an understanding of the terrain and the prevailing wind that let him use the storm rather than fight through it. Byzantine formations, already strained by internal divisions among their own multi-ethnic troops, began to fracture under conditions the Muslim army had, in effect, anticipated. It is the kind of detail that separates a commander who simply wins from a commander who engineers the exact conditions under which winning becomes almost inevitable. Putting together a video like this takes real time, cross-checking sources across different traditions and trying to get the history right rather than simply repeating the legend uncritically. If that kind of care matters to you, consider supporting the channel as a member. And to everyone already doing that, thank you. This entire series only exists because of you. By this point in the story, you have a commander who fought against the Prophet 3 separate times and lost none of those engagements to incompetence, who then converted and never lost a single battle for the other side either. 50 engagements by most traditional counts. Rebellions crushed at their most dangerous point. 2 empires pushed back within the space of a few years. A record that, on paper, looks less like a career and more like a myth someone invented after the fact. By nearly any traditional measure, this made him the most consistently successful field commander the early Muslim state had ever produced, a man whose name alone reportedly unsettled enemy commanders before a single sword was drawn. Which is exactly what began to worry Umar. Around 638, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab removed Khalid from military command entirely, along with his post as governor of Kinisrin. Most historians point to 2 intertwined reasons. Questions surrounding how the spoils of war were being distributed under his command, and something deeper, harder to legislate against. A growing concern that the armies, and the wider Muslim community, had started attributing victory to Khalid himself rather than to God working through him. Umar's worry was not that Khalid had failed at anything. It was that Khalid had succeeded so completely, and so consistently, for so long, that people had quietly stopped crediting anything else for it. The very thing that had made him the sword of Allah, an unbroken record that felt almost beyond human explanation, was the same thing that ultimately got him set aside, quietly, at the absolute height of his career. Sit with that for a moment. This is a man who had broken 2 empires' momentum in the same decade. A man given a title directly, personally, by the Prophet. Removed from command not because he had ever lost, but precisely because he never had, and that unbroken record had started to resemble, in the eyes of some, a rival to faith itself rather than a servant of it. Khalid did not resist the decision. He accepted it without recorded protest. And for the remaining years of his life, he lived without command, without the armies, without the campaigns that had structured every single year of his adult life since he first picked up a sword as a teenager. And then, around the year 642, Khalid ibn al-Walid died. Not in Persia. Not in Syria beneath a Byzantine blade. In a bed, from illness. The exact location is disputed among historians, some traditions placing it in Homs, others in Medina. What is not disputed is how he reportedly responded to it. Tradition holds that near the very end, Khalid looked back over a life spent charging into enemy formations, expecting every single time that this would be the day he did not walk back out, and he said, in essence, that there was not a single spot on his body left without a scar from a blade or an arrow, and yet here he was, dying quietly, the way common livestock die, in his own bed, with no enemy in front of him at all. That is not the reaction of a man afraid of death. Khalid had run directly toward death across 50 different battlefields. That is the reaction of a man who had built his entire identity around the belief that his life would end the way his battles had, on his feet, in motion, spent completely for something larger than himself. And instead, the ending arrived quietly, without witnesses to the moment itself, without a battlefield, without the one thing that had always given final meaning to everything he had ever done. Umar reportedly wept when the news reached him. Women of the Banu Maksum mourned him openly in the streets, and tradition holds that Umar permitted a public display of grief that was unusual for the customs of the time. The commander he had removed from power years earlier was still, by every surviving account, one of the most respected and mourned figures in the entire young Muslim state. His legacy did not need the battlefield to survive it. That legacy had already been secured, in 50 engagements, in a title spoken by the Prophet's own mouth, in an empire pushed back permanently at Yarmouk and another badly weakened in Iraq. So here is where all of this actually lands. We tend to assume a life like Khalid's is defined entirely by the battles. The 50 victories. The title. The empires that were forced backward because of what he built on those fields. And by every measure history typically uses, that is completely true. But the detail that actually stays with you, the detail this entire story has been building toward from the very first sentence, is what happened at the very end, in the one moment none of that mattered to him anymore. A man who had spent his whole adult life proving himself in motion, in danger, in service to something far bigger than his own survival, found himself facing an ending with none of that available to him. No enemy to face down. No formation to break through. Just a bed, and a body finally giving out on its own quiet terms instead of his. And maybe that is the part of his story most worth sitting with today. Not the 50 victories, remarkable as they are. What he thought, at the very end, about the one ending he had never trained for and could not control. Because most of us are not going to face dramatic circumstances either. Most of us are going to face something ordinary. An illness. An old age. A quiet room instead of a battlefield, an ending we did not choose and cannot script the way we imagined we would. And the question Khalid's story leaves sitting with you is not whether your own ending will be dramatic or memorable. It is whether you can look back, the way he ultimately did, at a life spent fully and spent on purpose, and know that even the most unremarkable ending cannot undo what you actually built while you were still standing. There is also something worth noticing in how Umar handled him. Removing Khalid from command was not, by any surviving account, a punishment born of anger or personal rivalry. It was a decision made by a leader who understood something uncomfortable about human nature. Given enough consecutive victories, given enough years of one name attached to every triumph, people will eventually start worshipping the name instead of the cause it served. Umar was not questioning Khalid's loyalty. He was protecting the community from a pattern that has repeated itself in every century since, the slow drift from admiring a person's gifts to depending on that person as though the outcome could never have happened without them. Khalid's undefeated record was real. But Umar understood that the story people told themselves about that record mattered just as much as the record itself, and he was willing to make an unpopular decision to correct the story before it hardened into something dangerous. Khalid seems to have understood this too, which is part of why he accepted the dismissal so quietly. There is no recorded bitterness, no faction he raised in protest, no campaign to reclaim his position. A man who had spent his entire adult life proving he could not be stopped on a battlefield allowed himself to be stopped by a single decision, without resistance, because the thing that had always mattered to him more than command was the cause the command had served. Khalid ibn al-Walid never lost a single battle in his life. And in the end, according to the traditions that remember him, the only thing that ever truly troubled him was not losing on some field of combat. It was simply stopping, quietly, without one more fight left to give. 50 battles is a number that belongs to history books. But the scars he counted on his own body at the end, the ones he mentioned in that final reflection, belonged to something more personal than any record of victories ever could. They were the proof, to him, that he had spent his life exactly the way he intended to spend it, fully and without holding anything back. The ordinary death did not erase that. It simply arrived in a form he had never planned for, and never quite made peace with, even at the very end. If this gave you a new way to see his story, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. That is genuinely how history like this reaches more people. Thank you for watching, and until next time.